So Bronze Age weapons and warfare really deserve far more attention than they generally get on channels like mine, and I'm trying to do my bit here to rectify that. Now, not that long ago I did a video looking at the possible reasons why Bronze Age swords usually don't have handguards, and based on the comments there and other things that I've been reading recently, there have been some absolutely wild and crazy ideas put across around Bronze Age swords. So in this video we're going to look and debunk, hopefully, 7 fairly common and some of them quite wild myths about Bronze Age swords. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and just quickly before we delve into these myths that I see spread around the internet about Bronze Age swords, I just want to mention, check out, if you're curious to know why Bronze Age swords very often don't have handguards, check out my thoughts in that video. Clearly the primary answer is shields. Okay, that is the primary answer, because a lot of swords you use throughout history with shields don't necessarily really need big handguards. That being said, many of them did have longer handguards, but even as late as the medieval period, some swords have really quite minimal handguards. But we're going to get into guards in a second. So let's have a look, grab a different sword here, let's have a look at 7 wild myths about Bronze Age swords. So something I see actually said fairly commonly about Bronze Age swords is that Bronze Age swords, because they were made of bronze, couldn't withstand, couldn't sustain, and weren't used in blade-on-blade contact, impacts with other swords. Whereas people, I think, assume, maybe people who aren't that familiar actually with things made of bronze, people assume that iron and steel enables this kind of blade-on-blade contact, and for the blade to sustain that in a way that bronze doesn't. Well, there's several things to unpack there, but I'm going to keep this concise. First of all, when steel blades, even hardened steel blades, collide with other steel blades, they take damage. It just happens. If two materials are the same, when they impact with a lot of force, they are going to get damaged. So to Iron Age swords, to later medieval steel swords, to modern steel training swords. I mean, our training swords get damaged all the time. So, if you've got 2 pieces of bronze, the relative hardness of them usually is in the same ballpark. One might be slightly harder than the other, based on the composition of the metal and the way that it's been worked. I'll get to that in a second. But when these 2 things collide, yes, they will take damage, number 1. But so will all other swords. But here's the really important thing, is that bronze is not as either brittle or as soft as some people assume it is. So in fact, without going into the material properties of bronze, we can also categorically state that from archaeology, we know that blades, bronze blades, did collide with each other, because we actually have blade damage, we have edge damage on Bronze Age swords. There's some famous examples, for example, in the Museum of London, which I've documented and spoken about on this channel myself. So absolutely, and not just swords, also things like large spearheads and stuff. We often see edge damage. Sometimes it's on the flat, so sometimes we see marks across the sort of midrib and the flat surface there. Sometimes it's edge into edge, sometimes it's from an oblique angle at 45 degrees or something like that. So absolutely, we know that blades, either deliberately or accidentally, we can't say which, were making contact with each other and were frequently hitting each other. Either sometimes in warfare, and sometimes I'm sure it was done for ritual significance to destroy a weapon before it was discarded. But the fact is, we have surviving Bronze Age swords with edge damage. So it did absolutely happen, and the swords could survive such impacts. Just to caveat that with, of course, I'm not saying that Bronze Age swords were used in fencing like sabres were in the 19th century. They were predominantly used with shields, at least most of the time. I'm sure some of the time the shield broke, or the person couldn't grab it in time and they were forced to just use the sword, in which case they pretty much have to parry with the sword if they didn't have something else to defend with, unless they're just dodging. But the fact is that yes, usually these were used with shields, so these are not, generally speaking, going to come into as much blade contact as later sword styles where a person only has a sword, or a sword and a dagger, or a sword and a buckler. However, we can categorically state that Bronze Age swords did have impacts with other bronze swords. Yes, they did take damage, but they did survive it. Now, the next weird myth I see written about Bronze Age weapons was that they weren't very sharp. There's, amongst some corners of the world, there's a perception that a blade which is made of iron or steel is inherently sharper than a blade made of bronze. And of course, that doesn't need to be true. They can both be taken down to absolute literal razor sharpness. People have made razor blades out of bronze. Now, indeed, it's not quite as durable because, of course, the hardness you can get with bronze doesn't achieve the levels that you can get with steel, certainly modern steels. But remember that what came after Bronze Age blades were iron blades, probably not steel blades yet. So there was a period of time where most of the iron blades around wouldn't have qualified as steel. They wouldn't have been heat quenched, for example. And actually the difference in hardness between iron and bronze is not as much as you might think. But the important point here is that bronze absolutely, having cut myself on bronze, I can tell you it can be absolutely surgically razor sharp. So just because it is a bit softer than steel doesn't mean that it can't be as sharp as. It can be absolutely razor sharp. Right, the next myth I sometimes see said is that bronze swords were harder to make than iron swords. Or sometimes, flipping that on its head, some people say that iron swords were harder to make than bronze swords. Well, look, this is one of those ones where it's more that they were just different. It's not that necessarily one is harder or easier, but it is, generally speaking, it's easier to get iron. So iron can be found all over the world. In many places in the world there is iron. In some cases you can even get iron off the surface of the ground without even mining. Bronze is reliant on two principal elements, that is copper and tin. What some of you might not know is that Bronze Age weapons made in the Bronze Age also have other deliberate elements put in, such as lead, which potentially helps the casting process, helps the molten material flow more easily in the mould. But fundamentally the difference between a bronze sword and an iron or steel sword is that this is cast in a mould and this is forged on an anvil. Okay, so you heat up a piece of iron once you've got the iron, once you've smelted it, you heat it up and you hammer it. Whereas bronze is poured, is molten, is melted and poured into a mould. Now that does mean you have to achieve quite high temperatures to melt the bronze. That being said, you also have to achieve very high temperatures to smelt the iron, to get the iron, even though the forging temperature is not particularly high. And you need to make the mould, and you'll notice that Bronze Age swords actually are far more complex in shape and cross-section than Iron Age or even early medieval swords. In fact, in cross-sectional shape and general form, Iron Age and even medieval swords generally are much simpler than these multi-ribbed and fullered and complex. And that is because in the Bronze Age you're casting the blade and you can make a very complex shape in a mould, which is more difficult and more laborious to forge. So is an iron or a steel sword easier or harder to make? It's just kind of different, and it depends partly on your access to the raw materials. And one of the advantages of bronze is it can be recycled more easily because, of course, it can be repeatedly melted and recast into new things. So the next crazy myth that I said about bronze swords is actually not entirely a myth. It's a little bit correct, but not as correct as some people think it is. So people go, oh, well, bronze swords are heavier than steel and iron swords, so that's why they tend to be shorter and they're more cumbersome and it changes the way you use them and everything else. Well, how much heavier is bronze than iron or steel? Do you know? Post down below if you do. The answer is between 5 and 10%. So it is slightly heavier, cubic centimetre for cubic centimetre. Bronze is usually between 5 and 10% heavier than iron or steel are, or rather than iron is. Steel is debatably can be a little bit lighter than iron. But here's the point. The point is that that's not a lot, okay? Between 5 and 10% doesn't make an awful lot of difference, and the simple fact is that, generally speaking, the Bronze Age swords were made within a very similar total mass, or weight if you prefer, as Iron Age swords. So if you pick up your typical gladius, it's about the same weight as one of these Bronze Age swords. Yes, indeed, you know, pound for pound, you can make a slightly longer or slightly broader iron sword for the same mass as a bronze sword, between 5 and 10%, but that's not an awful lot. And so the Bronze Age swords themselves aren't really heavier because they tend to be somewhat smaller than later Iron Age and certainly later medieval swords. So Are Bronze Age swords heavier? Well, the bronze is slightly heavier, but the swords aren't necessarily heavier because they're made smaller. Now, the next myth is not particular to swords, but to all bronze artifacts. I see some people saying that bronze in the ground doesn't corrode. Well, I can tell you it actually does. Now, the reality, of course, is that it doesn't corrode anything like as quickly as iron or steel does. So you can put a steel sword in the ground and the blade will almost be gone after a decade or two, depending what type of soil conditions and how moist the area you live in. If it's a quite arid environment, or indeed very cold, or indeed if it's anaerobic, so in the banks of a river or something like that, then steel can survive for centuries, millennia in some cases. So yes, in general, bronze is more corrosion resistant because it doesn't rust, it doesn't get eaten away quite as quickly as iron or steel does, but it does corrode. So iron in the ground is subject to the effects of corrosion from oxygen, moisture, and also the acidity in the soil, and particularly has an effect on the copper element of the alloy of bronze, which is primarily copper and tin. And indeed, it does become more brittle, and Bronze Age objects in the ground, while we might get a bronze sword out of the ground, they're often very brittle and they sometimes are corroded through. So bronze can corrode, just not as quickly as iron or steel. Researching for this video, I found out that's something called bronze disease, which I'd never heard of before. So the final couple of wild points that I hear, so one of these comes straight from that previous video I did, talking about why Bronze Age swords often don't have, or in some cases don't need, hand protection here. And some people's assertion is that Bronze Age swords either just didn't need handguards, or they hadn't yet been invented, and both of those are kind of wrong, okay? So first of all, we know that sometimes people needed handguards, but we also know that sometimes people had handguards because they did exist. So while I was using these swords for that particular video, and using these types of swords found mostly in Northern Europe, there are types of Bronze Age sword which absolutely do have hand protection on them, which sort of debunks my own video, I fully accept, although I did mention them in that video. Now, while I mentioned, if I just grab the shield, while I mentioned that generally speaking, when you're using a shield, you don't need a handguard as much as if you were just using the sword by itself. We have to remember, of course, that in later centuries, as we go into the medieval period, and you know, this Viking era sword, for example, and obviously these crossguards got longer and longer in the medieval period, they were still using them with shields. So clearly having a handguard when you've got a shield still serves a purpose, not only to protect your hand, but it also protects your fist from banging into opponent's shields or shield bosses or helmets or whatever. And of course it does protect your hand from their blade a bit more. But here's the thing, we know that in the Bronze Age, yes indeed, some Bronze Age swords don't really have any handguard to speak of, although you could argue that that is a bit of a handguard. But particularly if we look at Mycenaean or the sort of Bronze Age antennae swords, the early antennae swords, we do in fact see some of those Bronze Age swords do have deliberate handguards. They're not just a feature of the shape of the grip or anything like that. They are very obvious, especially on the Mycenaean ones. They are very obviously handguards to guard the hand. So there we go. It's a sort of myth that I think, you know, partly debunks some of the things I said in my video, I guess. But the fact is that handguards had been invented in the Bronze Age, and some people did think that they were worth having. And the last Bronze Age sword myth, which is really wild, and when I first read this as a comment, I assumed it was just a one-off comment, and it actually made me laugh, actually, which I don't mean to be condescending, but I'll explain why it's funny to me in a second. But then I found that numerous people had actually made the same comment. So this comes back to the corrosion resistance of bronze. So some people had hypothesized that perhaps these Bronze Age swords did have handguards made of organic material like wood or leather or antler or something like this, and that they had decayed away, much like the wooden grips usually do, and left the bronze blades, and so therefore that leaves us assuming that they didn't have handguards when they actually did have handguards. Well, here's the thing. So first of all, I've already mentioned that there were Bronze Age swords which did have bronze handguards as part of the casting of the tang, essentially, of the hilt. But here's the thing, we do have the organic hilts remaining. So the reason that we're able to recreate these organic hilts on these swords, and you know, Neil Burridge, who made both these swords, is one of the leading sort of replicators of these are based on organic finds. So we actually do have the organic hilts surviving from various situations. In particular, in very specific situations, they can survive in the ground. Sometimes they survive in places like bogs in anaerobic conditions, where organic material like bows and spear shafts and even bodies are preserved sometimes. But in addition to that, we also have particularly fancy versions of these hilts that sometimes, instead of being made of an organic material, like usually wood or horn or ivory or some tooth or something like that, are instead made of or covered in metal of some sort, usually bronze. It has to be said, bronze sheet, but can be silver or gold kind of ornamentation. So in some cases we actually have metal versions of these hilts surviving, so we know exactly what the hilt looks like, because in that particular case it wasn't made of organic material which rotted away. But we do also have the organic hilts. So quite simply, when we're dealing with something like this leaf-bladed sword here, the Wilburton sword as it's known, or one of the Ewart Park swords, we do know what the hilts look like on these things. So we're not completely lacking in data just because organic material usually corrodes. Anyway, I'm going to wrap it up there. Do you know of any other Bronze Age massive myths which are spread around about Bronze Age swords? I have to say, overall, I think that sometimes people who aren't familiar with Bronze Age swords think of them as being especially different or other from Iron Age or kind of, you know, later kind of steel swords like in the Roman era. And actually, fundamentally, they're not that different. This isn't very different to a Gladius Hispaniensis. And if my opponent had a shield and an iron Gladius, for example, and I had a shield and one of these, I wouldn't be at a disadvantage. This can cut really well, it can thrust really well, it's got the same amount of hand protection, it's about the same kind of size, it's about the same kind of weight. These Bronze Age swords are not really that different actually to certain Iron Age swords. I mean, that, for example, is functionally really similar to a hoplite's Xiphos, for example. Using one of these is not really materially any different to using a Xiphos. So there we go, Bronze Age swords. I think they're fantastic. There's a huge variety. There's actually quite a lot of research and stuff to read about them. What we really don't know is very much about the wider types of warfare and indeed the protective equipment, if any was worn in some cases, but I'm sure some was. We don't know much about the armour of quite a lot of the Bronze Age, unless we're looking at the Mycenaean stuff, for example. So it's a really interesting period, and Bronze Age weapons really deserve a lot more attention than they get. And because they are corrosion resistant, if not completely anti-corrosion, we do have some wonderful examples surviving from thousands of years ago in amazing condition in museums around the world. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I will of course continue to be. Please make sure you're subscribed, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.